in on this beautiful day where we don't have smoke or anything. It's so nice that you're choosing to come inside to hang out with me for about an hour. We will go through, I have some photos that I'll be sharing with you guys during my talk. And then there should be time for questions at the end, so feel free to hold them. But if you are just like, oh, I need to know now, you can also, shout them out or raise your hand or whatever, and ask during the midst of the talk as well. So either way works for me. So thank you for the introduction. This is my 16th year in Yellowstone, working for the National Park Service, although I did spend one winter working for an outfitter and one memorable summer as a maid at Grand Village. I have had a wide variety of roles in Yellowstone. I've thought a lot about Yellowstone over my life. I've been coming here my whole life. When I started this job as a historian, the previous historian at the university had left a list of what he thought were the 10 most influential events that had happened in Yellowstone, because everyone likes a top 10 list, right? It's handy. I've put together my own top 10 list, which is not exactly the same, but very similar. When I started really thinking even further about this topic, I realized something that had been kind of percolating in the back of my brain, and that is that, to my money, the single most influential event or management decision that has ever been made in Yellowstone's 152-year history is that day they decided to allow automobiles into Yellowstone. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to try to convince you that I'm right on that, okay? So hopefully I'll be somewhat successful, and if not, I'd love to debate with you. From there, let's go ahead. I have my little cheat sheet here, so I apologize if I have to pause to look at that. So, the park was established in 1872 on March 1st, and when the park was established, Gardner was not here. There were no formal roads in Yellowstone. The nearest, kind of like settled community was Bozeman, where you could get, supplies for an expedition, for instance. And so, as you know, it takes like an hour and a half in a fast car to get to Bozeman now. So it took several days to get to Bozeman then. The railroad was heading west and would arrive in Livingston in the late 1880s. So this is a pretty remote area as far as, places where you could have kind of jumping off points for explorations. So there were two explorations leading up to the establishment of Yellowstone. We have the photo on the right from the Hayden expedition. They were in the park in 1871. And then we have the first known map of Yellowstone Lake over there on the, nope, that's the right. Over there, the far side, is the first known map of Yellowstone Lake that was created by one of the members of the Washburn expedition in 1870. And what you can see on that map is that all of these squiggly lines here, those are not roads, those are streams and rivers. So there are no roads where we are going. Sounds like something out of Back to the Future. So these people here on the Hayden expedition that following year, they had this kind of rough map. But other than that, they were really following, kind of ancient pathways that had been established by Native peoples coming through the area and using the area for a variety of reasons. So those kind of ancient trails were still, still being used, and they were certainly used by the expeditions. And then also there were some game trails. Game does a good job of finding efficient ways to move through a landscape. So they were, kind of going off of what those who had been there before them were using, but they weren't roads. So of course, all horseback riding at that time. Our first superintendent didn't really come to the park, so he didn't have much influence on what we're talking about today, but our second superintendent was Philippus Norris. He came to the park, his first year as superintendent was 1877, and he was the first park manager that really saw, the Park Protection Act that established Yellowstone said that we were going to protect resources, but also provide for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, right? So there's this like dual mission just in our our framing document sets us up of like, well, what do we prioritize? How do we do that? How do we make sure that people can enjoy this place without kind of wrecking what they're coming to see? And Norris was the first one to kind of grapple with that in a real hands-on way. And he was the first superintendent to be pretty aggressive in actually making formal roads in Yellowstone. But he also at that same time was the first person to hire what we would call ranger. And he called him a gamekeeper then, or a warden. And he was the first Henry Yount, our first ranger, and he was there to protect the wild animals. So Norris saw, okay, well, I'm going to have roads because we need visitors, we need people, they need to be able to see this place, but we also need to protect the animals because with visitors came poaching. And with visitors then later on came vandalizing of our thermal features and taking obsidian and just kind of snowballed all of that unintended consequences of opening up roads brings in some bad parts of that. Some problems come with opening roads. So Norris is our first person to, like I said, establish roads. You can see them on this map here. We have just some really elementary, this is from 1879, and so he's already formalized, and when I say roads, I read one explanation of what they looked like. He basically went along with an axe and cut every tree down to where a wagon, like the axle, could clear it. And that was his road. He didn't make it a nice smooth byway or anything like that. But he was a busy guy, and so he has these kind of routes. I think there were probably also people who were coming to visit, and they would say, oh man, I need to get over that hill because I want to see what it is, so I might move some logs. And so I think there was also probably some informal road building. But I just think it's interesting that by 79, so that's 7 years after the establishment of Yellowstone, we are already seeing formalized routes. And that is going to play into my argument in a little bit. But I think what it also shows is that we have always been intrigued by specific locations around Yellowstone, and then the rest of the park kind of remains, like today, kind of wild, I guess you could say. They say that you can only see about 2% of Yellowstone from our roads today, and very few people go more than a mile from any road. And I think that what these early routes tell me is that this is probably something that's been going on for a long time in Yellowstone, that people find a route to go to specific places and then they kind of stick with it. So to deal with this problem of vandalism and poaching, but also trying to provide for visitor entertainment and enjoyment, the Secretary of the Interior asked the War Department at that time to send in the cavalry, literally. And they sent several troops to the park in 1886. Their mission was to, cut back on the poaching. That's kind of their number one priority, was to stop poaching. Secondly, was to kind of educate visitors and get them to knock it off with trying to demolish some of our thermal areas. There was, people were throwing things into thermal features. They were chipping pieces off of the cones on Old Faithful, trampling all over. It was really tourism run amok. And there were we didn't have really much of a budget to manage Yellowstone in the early years, so there was maybe 1 or 2 people to manage this entire 2.2 million acres, and they were just not up to that task, unsurprisingly. So in 1886, the military arrived, and this is them just right out here, right between the arch and where the entrance station is, that road out there. And with them came the Army Corps of Engineers. So a lot of people talk about the importance of the Army in protecting resources, in saving the last wild bison, and they did a lot of really important work in Yellowstone. But I think the folks that get not enough credit for how much they influenced the park is the Army Corps of Engineers. So they arrived with the Army and immediately set about improving Norris's roads and surveying and coming up with good routes. Surprisingly, Norris had a pretty solid eye for a good route through a forest, so they were able to use some of his routes that he had already established, but then they improved those in areas that needed it. The routes that you take today to go around Yellowstone are essentially the same alignment that the Army Corps of Engineers established. So this photo here is taken at what they called the National Hotel, or the National Park Hotel, because Yellowstone was the only one, or just Mammoth Hotel. And this was completed in 1883, so it had already been here for 3 years before the Army got here. But all these gentlemen here in this photo are road crew here to make this enormous effort to allow visitors throughout Yellowstone. So we relied a lot on horsepower, real, actual horsepower, in our early transportation. This is the Yellowstone Park Transportation Company stagecoach. These are called tally-ho coaches, 6-horse. It's very difficult to drive 6 horses, so the few stagecoach drivers that could do that were the best paid. And this coach would have been one that they would have gotten onto at the depot here in Gardner, and they would have ridden that up through the canyon and up to Mammoth. That looks terrifying, but I'm sure it was a thrilling ride. After that first experience, the rest of their route would have been in 4-horse wagons. It was much more sedate, and you only had a few people on rather than like 20. But the route then was you would spend about 7 days going around Yellowstone, and you would stop every night at a hotel that was about a day's stagecoach ride apart. And then once you saw all the sights, you'd be back into Mammoth, and then they'd say goodbye, and you would head back down to Gardner and get back on a train and head out on the rest of your journey. So this is an expensive endeavor, right? Like that's a lot. You have to get to Yellowstone, first of all, and then you have to have the time to take off, any kind of work and go on a vacation for at least 7 days in the park, let alone the travel time on both sides. And then also, you had to be able to afford to pay for the tour and the hotels. So this was not something for the middle or lower class person. You would have needed to be very wealthy to visit Yellowstone in this time. And it would have been a pretty significant engagement of your funds, your time, but also your social cachet, where you could kind of brag, like, oh yes, I went to Yellowstone, I went to our national park. There's visitors coming from around the world, and there's newspaper accounts. People would go home and be like, and send letters to their newspapers saying, oh, I was visiting the national park, and it was definitely something that right away struck the world as something to do, and it was very exciting. And it was all on these rudimentary roads and these horse-driven carriages. When I say rudimentary roads, I really mean rudimentary roads. These are good roads in Yellowstone, and We've got, this is a two-horse little buggy there. This is actually just right outside the park on the east entrance. And then this is them trying to kind of clear a road through this forest using horses and plows and everything to make way. And these roads were horrible when it would rain. People were constantly getting stuck. Passengers, no matter their social class, would have to get out and push. And so this was, it was a dusty, dirty, and exhausting visit through Wonderland, and people loved it. So this, again though, people are really focused on staying on the roads, and they are focused on seeing the big sites like Old Faithful Geyser, like the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. You know, early on, Old Faithful had really good PR, and so people knew right away they wanted to go see Old Faithful. You know, they called it White Mountain or Mammoth Hot Springs. These are destinations known throughout the world. So for a long time, we kind of rubbed along with our stagecoaches. Some people would come in their own conveyances, you know, like a wagon, or a buggy with their own horses, and they would camp. But most people, the vast majority of people, came on these tours and stayed in the Yellowstone Park Company hotels. They ate their food. They went in their subsidiaries' stagecoaches. And there was a growing movement leading up to 1915 of automobiles becoming more and more popular around the country. And organizations like AAA were started agitating for more places for cars to be available. And so by 1915, kind of the public chorus of wanting cars in Yellowstone convinced the military that, okay, fine, we're still here managing Yellowstone 32 years later, or 30 years later, and we will bow to the inevitable and we will let cars in. But we're going to have both. We're going to have cars and horses. We're going to have a very complex system where you can only go one way at certain times of the day, and like horses are only allowed at certain times, and cars are only allowed at certain times, and cars have to stop so they don't scare the horses, and but we'll make it work. So they tried, this first automobile came in 1915 in the tail end of the summer. So they tried the summer of 1916 to have this dual horse-car situation, and it was utter chaos. There were wrecks with horses all over this place. The horses were not amused by running into cars, these loud, banging, Model Ts, and these are not like nice, quiet, Teslas. These are very, very loud automobiles, and it really did not work well to try to have both animals and cars on the roads at the same time. So we underwent a drastic change, and this is that year of 1915, we said, okay, we're opening the door to cars, and by the beginning of 1917, we had already had a sea change in how people were going to experience Yellowstone. And automobiles would become the number one way, private automobiles, followed by these kind of tours here that are Yellowstone Park Transportation Company buses. This would become the number one way that people experience Yellowstone, and it's still the way people experience Yellowstone today. How many of you guys have driven through the park? Right, yeah. How many of you have been on a tour in the park? Just a few of you, right? So it's still to this day, and we're in an organization that offers tours, right? We are in YF is, I kind of expected a few more of you to have gone on a tour, but that it just goes to show how pervasive this idea of your kind of choose your own adventure is in Yellowstone with your own car. So right away, the Yellowstone Park Transportation Company, you start to think about this, they had thousands of horses. They had wagons to deliver supplies. They had stagecoaches to deliver people, and stagecoaches and wagons to deliver luggage. They had, a huge infrastructure to support the visitation that was going on. And overnight, essentially, they had to get rid of all of that and switch completely over to motorized vehicles. I can only imagine if we told Xanterra, hey, next spring you can only use horses. I mean, they would be like, no. Like, that's just, the financial outlay of that kind of decision is kind of shocking. And so that change heralded these drastic changes just from the very nature of making this decision, and then the kind of unintended consequences that came from it really just kind of barreled and snowballed along. So we first of all needed to work on those roads. We said no horses unless we were using them to improve the roads for the cars. We did a lot of road building with draft horses and mules and pickaxes, and it was a arduous experience. I just have several photos because I just think it's amazing what they do here with these horses. This just looks like a bad day at work to me. And this is hard labor, kind of scraping out routes that automobiles can go on. What is a horse can be made to go up, sometimes you can't make an automobile go. So we had to have different grades and different routes to accommodate automobiles. And so even though we were able to use most of the roads, although they had to be improved, we also did have to build new roads to accommodate these automobiles. And it was just hard, backbreaking work. Here they're trying to smooth out and grade this route. These last three are all on the East Entrance Road. So this was also a huge undertaking as far as staffing goes. They had hundreds of people working on these roads. So this was an economic boom to the area. I gave the livestock a few more years of, these are mules here. So we had this kind of remnant of the way things were with our road building crews for a while, but ultimately, of course, even they were not useful anymore for building our road system. We also then started to get fancy and having really beautiful bridges. Bridges around the world can be known for their beauty, and Yellowstone was no different. This is the Chittenden Bridge over by the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, and it is no longer in use today, but if you're like at Uncle Tom's Trailhead, you can look out and see the abandoned span still across the river. So we started having to have, horses and wagons and stuff are heavy, but cars are heavier. And so we have to have a very different infrastructure to support cars. Not just the roads, but also our bridges need to be reinforced in order to make it safe for visitors. We're still not talking about a smooth sailing, though. I love reading the accounts of people who get in their cars, like in St. Louis, and they head west to come to Yellowstone, and they break down like every 5 miles across the nation. They're having to fix their own cars. Flat tires, I don't know how they had enough rubber trees to create enough tires for people to get to Yellowstone. They would overheat trying to get up grades, and then their brakes would burn up trying to get back down the mountain on the other side. It was just a very, I think you had to have gone into it thinking this is going to be hard, and that's the fun of it, because, man, it would have been frustrating, I think, with all of the delays. These trips would take a very long time. However, the automobile, in addition to these kind of physical on-the-ground changes, We also saw a change in the demographics of our visitors. All of a sudden, you can choose your own adventure. You can decide how long you're going to stay in the park. You can maybe swing into the park as you're going a trip across the country. You can just, you can decide how long you're going to spend. You can bring a picnic basket and all of your own stuff, and camping started becoming more of a thing once you can have your own automobiles. You're not just bringing your wagons with you. And so there was a kind of a democratization of the visitors that arrived in Yellowstone at this time. You still, by and large, had to be a certain level of wealth to get here, because it is not something that, a lot of parks are created near a large urban center, so they have a lot of visitation of people just on day trips. You still had to have quite a lot of expendable income to be able to come to Yellowstone and not be working and have that money saved to be able to do this, even if you were in your own automobile, that you, by the way, had to be a certain economic viability to even own an automobile. But it was certainly a step in a different direction, a better direction for visitation and who could come and see this wonderland. So I am going to shift now. That's kind of like the basis of our road system, right? So we started off with horse roads, then we got car roads, and our visitation makes that shift with with the introduction of the automobile. And that introduction of the automobile is right around here. 1915, we get rid of horses in 1917, and you can see, visitation was pretty flatline up there. We start counting visitation in 1904. We don't have really good, accurate statistics for before 1904. And then we start seeing significant climbs. Anybody have any guesses on what that dip there is?
World War II.
World War II, yes. And the Depression. The Depression didn't help visitation. That's that little dip there at the heart of the Depression. And then this is World War II, where the park essentially closed. And for at least 1 year, many things closed for 2 years. And then we see the emergence of the American post-war car culture, right? We are a nation that is on the go. We are newly affluent, coming out of the war and the Great Depression, and we have money in our pockets, and we want to explore our country. The nation is exhausted from being in war, in World War I and World War II, and this newfound freedom after World War II leads to this precipitous increase in visitation, and that is largely driven by this car culture. All of a sudden, going on a great summer vacation and a road trip is a thing. Before this car culture, road trips wouldn't have meant anything to people. But once you have your own sweet ride, you can go, and you see this general now growth of visitation as cars became more and more reliable. They became more and more available to all classes of Americans and people from abroad. We still had tours and things like that where people would come and have a group experience, but the vast majority of people were coming in their own automobiles, and those tours were becoming less and less interesting to people. A weird connection with that is that whereas before we had these grand hotels like the National Hotel at Mammoth, and then of course Old Faithful Inn and the Lake Hotel. These are grand hotels where people would come, and you can just imagine the stagecoach coming up and dropping people off, and they're having balls at night and they're dressing up, and it's a very fancy experience. With the automobile, hotels suddenly really lost their popularity. And this is when we start not only having campgrounds becoming really popular, and we needed to build that infrastructure so that people weren't just running amok and camping wherever they wanted to. We also saw the emergence and popularity of lodges and cabins. So not only are you having an individual experience in your car, you're also having an individual experience in your lodging every night. You're in your own little contained unit of a space. as opposed to being in a hotel where you're kind of mixing with a lot of other people. We got rid of quite a few hotels. Once we were no longer needing them to be about a stagecoach drive apart where people could do the loop in a day or two. Now we don't need as many hotels, and we're going to rely more on these lodges. So the Roosevelt Lodge was the first to be built, and that was in 1920. So that had little cabins, and it was very rustic, but very popular, and started that trend. So now there's lodges. At this point, they started building lodges at Mammoth, and of course Old Faithful and Lake. And there was there was one on Sylvan Pass on the east entrance. Yellowstone, another great part of Yellowstone is what no longer exists in the park. And some of these buildings that I'm talking about are really products of a bygone era, and a fun thing to think about what it would be like to be able to see these spaces nowadays, but I digress. Okay, so we see this marked increase in visitation. We talk about visitation a lot in Yellowstone. I've worked in the superintendent's office on visitor use management for winter and for summer. But the basic, what you need to know is the numbers are going up and they are accelerating these days. It's likely, I think, that we'll hit 5 million this year. I've been in the park for 16 years, and I remember when we hit 3 million for the first time. So, we are getting more people quicker than we have in the past. And I think what you can see is that roads and the automobiles on those roads dictate kind of everything that happens in Yellowstone. Visitors, I don't know, I belong to approximately 1 million Facebook groups and Reddit threads and all kinds of social media having to do with Yellowstone. And everyone wants, the first thing they want to know is where do I go, what entrance do I drive into, and can I have who has a map? They want to, they're not coming here to this place and thinking, I'm going to just kind of get out and walk and explore. They're thinking, okay, where can I get my car to the fastest, and then once I'm in the park, can I get to where I want to go fastest in my car? So visitor trip planning is very dictated by automobiles and drive times. This is a map from Xanterra, and it has mileage, but it also has average minutes. I think they're a little outdated. I think I've been hearing, especially this summer, that Madison to Old Faithful can take several hours, not 45 minutes. Here's 21 miles and 1 hour. We're talking not just the distance you're traveling, but also the time it's going to take in your car to get somewhere. So that's critical information here, right up there with this is where you can get medical help. You also need to know how long it's going to take for you to get around in the park. It's also concessions management is strongly dictated. Concessions are where they have centers basically along this road route. Okay, so we have concessions managing Xanterra, Delaware North, the folks that operate our clinics. These are all along roadways in developed areas. So that's where they are developing their concessions, but it's also they use these roads and their cars to deliver all of their supplies. All of Xanterra's laundry is done in Gardner. So every day, all of the towels that they use at Grant Village and the sheets and everything are brought over these roads to Gardner to be washed. So these roads are critical for this kind of underlayment of management for Yellowstone. And also, of course, that's how employees get to work. When they arrive in the spring, like I did in '96, a dewy-eyed young woman thinking it was going to be so cool to be a maid at Grant Village. I arrived here in Gardner, and I was brought here in a car. And then my summer was in some ways terrible because I didn't have a car. I was at Grant Village without a car, and I was really stuck. And I couldn't do a lot of things. I had to rely on other people who had cars to really fully experience Yellowstone. It was, I don't advise it, especially Grant being, kind of off the beaten path. So, the concessions use these roads to get the visitors to them, as well as their employees and all their supplies. Of course, our emergency responses, we do have live flights, but hopefully, if you're ever in an accident, you only need, maybe a ranger to come up in a patrol vehicle to check on you, or if you have to be transported, hopefully it's minor enough that you can be in an over-the-road ambulance. And so our emergency responses are so important on our roads. One of the biggest drivers that we have when we think about, how are we going to deal with traffic in the park? One of the biggest drivers is we want to make sure that the roads can be cleared well enough for ambulances to get through bear jams and bison jams and get through Hayden Valley in a quick manner to get to accidents and to get to heart attacks and whatever else attacks. And so, this infrastructure of the road is so critical for us to be able to take care of our visitors. It's also critical, of course, for our visitor protection, or for our resource protection. That's whether that's me being able to go out and quickly go and look at a historic building when we're trying to decide if it's eligible for the National Register to protect that resource, or it's our bear crews getting out to haul a carcass away in one of their rigs to a carcass dump so that we don't cause bear jams. We have, bear jams. Those are all individual cars that are backed up for miles and miles and miles. So the road is that living heartbeat or circulation system, and not just like circulation, but like truly like the blood running through Yellowstone's veins is kind of our roads. We can't think about Yellowstone without realizing, and our road system without realizing, it's also part of a multi-state travel corridor, right? A lot of people come to Yellowstone because they just want to get through it. They live in Livingston and they want to go visit somebody in Jackson. So they just go through Yellowstone. So we are also part of a larger organism of roads that service cars that are not here for fun. This is just in their way to go somewhere else. So automobiles, it's not obviously unique to Yellowstone that people like cars. We continue our post-war obsession with cars here in America. I love this image. This is out of the Yellowstone Park Archives, which is at the Heritage and Research Center, just over on the other side of the school. I came across this image one day, and I just thought it was so neat, because it encapsulates what I'm kind of talking about on this change really well, I think. This is from 1999, and we show these early roads are like windy and kind of like we said, we want a park-like driving experience, so people kind of like go quietly through the park and stop and see stuff. And then in the 30s and 40s, we're like, cars go faster. We probably need to straighten some curves. And so we see this evolution of road design to accommodate faster automobiles. And then, this is present as in 1999, but you're seeing that our road that was this kind of like leisurely, Model T or horse-drawn carriage all the way to here, where automobiles and their speed and their size has led us to need roads that are not, that just have way more graceful, let's say, bends and turns. And so I think that's an interesting evolution, not just in, what the physical, it looks like something, but the idea about why we have to do this and why we are changing Yellowstone's environment to accommodate automobiles and visitation is fascinating to me, and I love this graphic that shows that story. I want to talk just a little bit about a little further about how cars are influencing our experience. Not just our experience, but also the wildlife experience. So there's kind of a new theory in ecology, a little bit of history field, thinking about roadside ecology, where all of a sudden you have completely different kind of population dynamics and behavior amongst wildlife and different vegetation and everything that is really dictated by the presence of roads and automobiles. Bringing in seeds in the bed of your truck, and those seeds are flying out as you drive along the roads of Yellowstone. Or, for instance, our roadside beggar bears that luckily are a thing of the past. But we still have bears that hang out on the side of the roads, and our biologists believe that that is because it is safer for a sow to raise cubs next to a road, because the big boars who have the inclination to kill the cubs, they kind of stay away from roads. So we have this kind of artificial but deeply ingrained new way of wildlife interacting with their environment and being drawn to the roads, sometimes to their detriment, but also sometimes to people's enjoyment, right? It's exciting to see bears on the side of the road. But it also can be really bad when you hit a bear with your car. And so this is kind of a good side, bad side aspect of automobiles and our animals. I like to think that automobiles they do rule Yellowstone's roads, except for the bison, of course. Bison jams, this here, this is a tame example of what a bison jam can look like in the summer. Especially during the rut, which is going on now, these can be hours and hours and hours of sitting in traffic and seeing these animals behaving in their kind of natural element right next to the roads. And people love to stop and look. Some of these folks are using pullouts. It's great. But of course, a lot of people will just stop their car on the road and hop out and kind of abandon their car in excitement and go and look. But I like to also think of cars as kind of like our home base, right? Like, stay in your car, that's where you're safe. So cars are definitely part of how we are interacting with wildlife on this scale as well. Parking and waiting, the last few years we've been telling people to pack their patience when they come visit Yellowstone. Waiting is a rite of passage here in Yellowstone. This is at Norris Geyser Basin. When I first started in Yellowstone, there was we never even thought that the day would come when Norris would be too many cars. Like, that parking lot was never full. And now, we've had to expand it, and a lot of times there's hours and hours wait to get into Norris. Same with Midway Geyser Basin. All of a sudden we're thinking, what are we gonna do? Another good example of this is the new, this is about 6 years old, parking lot at Ferry Falls to get up to the Grand Prismatic Overlook. We were like, man, everybody wants to see down onto Grand Prismatic because that's the spectacular view. But we don't want people driving and parking on the side of the road and damaging all the vegetation, so we better just build a parking lot. I did the compliance for that parking lot when I worked for Yellowstone Center for Resources in the compliance branch. And that was going to be a temporary parking lot while we figured out like a long-term solution, and it's still there. These are these unintended consequences of having cars and depending on them so much for this visitor experience. Of course, we also you can't have anything about roads without talking about wolf watching. This should actually be called not roadside wildlife watching, but roadside wolf watching. This is a whole new since '95 phenomenon where the roads are suddenly important, for people to see animals, which they've always done, obviously, but also to understand this kind of, you can watch like the wolf pack dynamics play out right from your car on the side of the road. It's amazing. One day I was sitting in my car and I saw two packs meet each other out in Lamar and play like puppies together, and it was like, I still get goosebumps thinking about that. And that was just right there. So understanding of wildlife and interactions and the science of ecology is all evolving, and some of it is playing out right through your windshield. Of course, I can't talk about roads without mentioning winter. These are spring plowing operations, and we went through a long time, about 15 years of litigation on what we were supposed to do with winter and how we could accommodate. Should we have tours? Should we have private snowmobiles? Do we consider this? Do we kind of go back to a throwback of tours, or do we kind of embrace over snow like individual snowmobiles, like individual cars? We've kind of got a hybrid solution now for the winter time, but then the park basically closes for about 6 weeks while we clear all that snow out every spring. And so we are madly moving snow around every, starting in mid-March through April, trying to get ready so that people can enter through our gates in the beginning of May. And that is a huge cost. It's millions of dollars to plow these roads, after having maintained them as snow roads all winter. And so this is a huge draw on our annual budget. It also requires a lot of manpower to operate all of this heavy equipment. It also plays out in our natural disasters. We've had 3 modern natural disasters that I'm kind of focusing on in this slide. We've had the '59 quake, and the biggest changes in the '59 quake that occurred in the park, the quake was actually outside of the park, but it was large enough that it was felt inside the borders of Yellowstone. And we had some thermal activity that was unusual. We had some buildings were kind of damaged, but the most obvious and the things that they jumped right on were clearing the roads from these massive boulders that would fall down. So this is Gibbon Falls here, that kind of roadway that snakes along the Gibbon River and the falls, where these massive boulders came down and halted. For a while there, everyone was kind of stuck in Yellowstone because all the routes out were blocked by large rocks. And so that was a major effort and the biggest impact within the park of the '59 quake. In the '88 fires, it was daily announced what roads were still open. Could people still come in the park because they still wanted to see the fire? They wanted to see Yellowstone. They'd been planning to come to Yellowstone, but of course, it was on fire. And so it was a big deal on whether or not they were going to allow cars on any given road on any given day. And this was announced in the media on a daily basis. And much talked about in the daily press across the nation. And then if anybody was here in 2022, they know kind of how hamstrung the park was when our north entrance road and our northeast entrance roads were demolished by the floods. And thus began what I found to be a very challenging summer of my office being down at the Heritage and Research Center, but the resource being at the other side of an impassable road. It made me really appreciate the ability to just hop in my truck and run up to Mammoth real quick to see my coworkers and to see my boss. And to be able to go out into the field and see historic buildings and evaluate whether they should be on the National Register, just the things that impacted my job, I was really amazed, let alone, of course, the impact to communities like Gardner that was, kind of came to a halt in a lot of ways in 2022 because people couldn't access the park. The roads were closed, the roads were gone. And so these natural disasters, oftentimes, the biggest impact is to our infrastructure that our automobiles use. And so they, a flood has a lot to do with, it took out some historic bridges, wiped out a historic cabin, but by far the most costly and most costly as far as money and experience was the loss of the roads. I do want to end with some helpful links. These are some great resources that the park has put out, as well as our folks in the archives share a lot of like old maps and a lot of our records on the Montana Memory Project or Montana History Project, and that's at mtmemory.org. Also, if you want to see cool pictures of Yellowstone buses, those can be found, the cool Yellowstone yellow buses, those can be found on the Buses of Yellowstone Preservation Trust out of Red Lodge. They have a website there that you can go check out. And then I also, if anybody wants to do further reading on the management of Yellowstone and kind of this evolution of how we manage visitors and resources and that kind of sometimes uncomfortable relationship between those two aspects of our mission. These are all, I think, pretty solid resources that people should definitely check out. Right now, my favorite of this list is probably Empire Shadows, Epic Story of Yellowstone by George Black. Just for a little plug for that book. I really think he did a fine job of scholarship for Yellowstone in that.